Welcome to the Religion and Popular Culture podcast, the podcast where we discuss religion, popular culture, and everything in between. My name's Alan Thomas, and I am joined this week, as always, by my lovely friend and colleague, Vivian Asimos. How are you, Vivian?
I'm good. A little tired, but all good.
Yeah, coming to the end of that summer period where a little bit worn out.
Yeah.
Have you had a busy summer?
Sure, we'll blame it on summer and not just my general life.
Just life. Coming to the end of life. Yeah, I'm quite tired too, but hopefully we will feel energized by today's conversation because it's something that...
I admit I'm already a little excited because this is one of my favorite topics to talk about.
Good. So we will be energized by a mutual love of ours, which is Lord of the Rings. Today we're going to unpack Lord of the Rings in relation to religion and popular culture. And if you're a listener of the podcast, you'll already be familiar with our love of Lord of the Rings and how we've managed to squeeze it into most of the conversations that we've had throughout this series.
I think so.
Partly because we love it, of course, but secondly, it's a very rich source of conversation when it comes to religion and popular culture, and sometimes in some unexpected ways as well that I think is quite fun. There's, of course, so much to Lord of the Rings, not just in the novels themselves and in the film series, but also the world that Tolkien built around Lord of the Rings, his archives, and the work of Christopher Tolkien as well, that's really expanded on the world of Lord of the Rings in a really fun way. I certainly know that when I watch the Lord of the Rings movies, which I do really frequently, I often have a Lord of the Rings wiki open on my phone because they'll make references to certain things that aren't explained whatsoever, and you can quickly look at it on your phone, and I think it really enhances the experience, and I'm really grateful to the wonderful people who compile these Lord of the Rings wiki because they do all the work for me and I can quickly find out what this one leaf signifies that just gets mentioned in a throwaway comment. So there's so much to discuss, isn't there? Vivian, do you love Lord of the Rings?
Oh, so much. I have a very special relationship with Lord of the Rings for quite a number of reasons. The first of which is that when I was going through a bit of a depression when I was quite a bit younger, I was reading Lord of the Rings. And at the end of Lord of the Rings, I know lots of people complain about the Return of the King having like 8 different endings, and the book is no exception.
The book is worse, if anything.
It's way worse with it. But one of the things that I really appreciated was that they talked very openly, essentially, about PTSD. And in it, it was the first kind of fantasy fairy tale that I read where they talked about trauma and how there wasn't a perfectly happily ever after, everyone goes home and returns to their everyday life element to it. And it was actually really comforting because I had just experienced a bit of trauma, and so to know that like it was okay that I wasn't able to return to how I was before was actually really comforting. And then I had another little bout of love with Lord of the Rings when I went to uni and I was taking a religion class that was Tolkien and religion. And so we got to read all of the Lord of the Rings. We read the Silmarillion. We got into all of those notes and extra material that you're talking about. And we got to just talk about how it relates to religion in so many different ways for a whole semester. And that's what got me to switch to having my primary degree be religious studies. Because before it was creative writing.
So it's Lord of the Rings that steered you in the direction. It
was Lord of the Rings. It was Lord of the Rings that did everything, and that's why I have a Lord of the Rings tattoo on me, because it was such a pivotal position of popular culture in my life. So for all of those, for professional reasons, for personal reasons. So Lord of the Rings has a very, very special place in my heart, and I feel like we could talk for many, many, many episodes on Lord of the Rings, but I will try to keep this episode to not be like 8 hours long.
Well, if it feels like it'll become 8 hours long, we'll just have to make more podcasts on Lord of the Rings, won't we?
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. I also love Lord of the Rings. Um, I I had a bit of an interesting relationship with Lord of the Rings. I went to the cinema to see Fellowship of the Ring when it first came out, and I did not care for it. And I'm not entirely sure why. I think it was because I had no concentration at the time. I'd been taken to see it. I didn't really express an interest in seeing it, so I kind of didn't want to be there to begin with. And I look back and I kick myself now because I love Lord of the Rings. Then years later, I watched the all the extended editions and absolutely loved it. So I've never seen the theatrical editions of Two Towers and Return of the King. I've only seen the extended editions, which are the only versions anyway.
Well,
Theatrical
yes.
editions, what are those? And then I went and read the books. And I've always felt that the Lord of the Rings adaptation, the film adaptation, has this lovely way of complementing the book and the book
Mm.
complementing the film, that whenever I end up rewatching them, I then read the book, or if I read the book, I then have to rewatch the films. They kind of both come as a package in my mind. I'm sure there are many Tolkien purists out there who would scoff at that, and that's fine. But I think those films definitely do complement it in a nice way, and they stopped there. They never bothered making Hobbit films, which is great. They definitely didn't. You may think that they did. They didn't. They did. They just didn't happen. But parking that to one side, well, where to begin with religion and Lord of the Rings, Vivian? You've done a Tolkien and religion class. Where would you say is the best place to start a conversation? Because
Well,
I've got some
I
notes,
think,
but
yeah, I mean, I think for me, my favorite place to start is always myth, but that's from a
yeah.
personal standpoint. But I think one of the things that's really interesting to always keep in mind is Tolkien's own personal background and his
Hmm.
relationship to the writing of the texts, as well as his own personal religious belief. He was a
Hmm.
very strong Catholic, and I think a lot of his religion comes out when you're reading it, despite the fact that it's not overtly, it's not like a C.S. Lewis book where it's very overtly Christian centric. There's hints of it in places. But what's really interesting is when you read Tolkien's letters, he has this way of talking about writing where he discussed it in a way of almost like channeling the writing. He kind of talked about how he would just sit down and he would just write, and he had no forethought. It just kind of came out of him. And he would end up having to rationalize things that he didn't personally agree with, but that he had written. So there's sometimes this really interesting dynamic in the text where you can see bits of Tolkien, but then you also see bits of Tolkien battling with Tolkien, which is
Hmm.
such a fascinating kind of dynamic to look into. But probably the most Christian and myth focused book is the Silmarillion. And this is
Yes.
the book that sets up the world of Lord of the Rings. So they have, it starts with the creation myth, which echoes a lot of Genesis.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. Very to the extent where in the Lord of the Rings myth there is a monotheistic god
Yes.
that I think is really interesting because when I read up on this years ago, I kind of worked my way backwards from the events of Lord of the Rings to the origin, so you could kind of see it breaking down. So you've got Gandalf and the wizards who are yeah, they're kind of like angels, I want to say.
Kind of.
Yeah, and then there's a tier above them, I think, and then there's the monotheistic god. And I can't remember the name of the god. It's something beginning with E, isn't it?
It's Ea, I think. I don't know how to
That's
pronounce it,
it.
but it's just EA, and the A's got two dots over it.
That's it. And the only intervention I believe that this god does in the events of The Lord of the Rings is slowly guiding the ring towards Bilbo so that it can then go to Frodo. I think there's even a line in Lord of the Rings that, in fact, it's Gandalf that said it, that Bilbo was meant to find the ring.
Mm-hmm.
And then Frodo's meant to find it. So that was the only intervention from the deity, the one ultimate reality in the events of Lord of the Rings. And then you've got other beings then that influence what happens from then on. And the interesting thing about Lord of the Rings is that it kind of plonks you at the end of this myth, because it's before the so-called Age of Men begins, and it's kind of positioned as this will then become our kind of world.
Yeah, so Tolkien's kind of general idea was that he didn't really feel like England had a mythology. And I stress here England because that's kind of truth of it. Wales has a really strong history of its own mythology. Ireland has a really strong mythology. Scotland has some mythology in it. England kind of just steals stuff from Welsh mythology and pretends it's theirs.
No comment.
It was like the King Arthur's really like one of the only ones that people say is English, but there's a lot of people who say that was originally Welsh. So
yes,
so there's really nothing that is, at least that has been carried forward in time, that has been English. So that was what Tolkien set out to do, was he kind of created a mythology for England. So this idea of Middle Earth is that it's actually it's England before it was England. So the idea of the Lord of the Rings is kind of setting you up to experience England the way that we know it.
Only much larger though, isn't it?
Well, yes.
Geographically. Sorry, this is just me getting into a fan conversation. I was just thinking the time it takes them to get from the Shire to Mordor. If you were to go from Durham to Portsmouth. I don't know why I'm analysing this.
Well, I think they do also a lot of other, I think, Europe in general kind of hinting at. So there was some kind of thought that his kind of hinting at an evil rising in the East when he was writing The Hobbit, was kind of hinting to what was going on in Germany at the time. So if you think about it as a sense of Mordor's Germany.
Yeah, for years I interpreted the Scouring of the Shire at the end of the third book as being a allegory for Britain after the war. That Britain fought in a war and won, but essentially the country was left in ruins.
Yeah.
Physically and financially after the Second World War, and that the hobbits return to the Shire, and you expect this happy ending, but no, the Shire's in a state, despite the fact they've saved Middle-earth. But in a copy of Lord of the Rings that we have, there is a introductory preface from Tolkien where he rejects that, because many people had come to the conclusion that it was an allegory for that, and that it wasn't meant to represent that. However, people are naturally going to.
Yeah.
And I think you are going to draw comparisons between what was happening at the time of the text being written and what is in the text.
Yes.
So I can definitely see that aspect to it.
And I mean, when you read it, his description of the Shire it's England, and his description of hobbits it's very English. Especially as someone who's an immigrant here, you can really, when he's talking about the culture of hobbits, it's very clearly that he saw the Shire as England, and then potentially the rest of it was, the land outside that you kind of go to, and you travel through. But yeah, it's very English.
And this is part of the myth itself, isn't it? The Lord of the Rings, pardon me. Middle Earth is almost a world in and of itself, that a lot of the inhabitants of Middle Earth don't know what's
Yeah.
beyond the sea. And it's when you go beyond those boundaries that the world of Lord of the Rings becomes very esoteric. Particularly with regards to the undying lands that the elves travel to, which is laced in metaphor because it's a physical land that they travel to, but it's presented as death and that it's something that can't be returned from.
Yeah. I mean, it's tricky, and especially the elves is tricky because they were the first race that was crafted. And I say crafted because Tolkien did not believe that anybody could create except the primary monotheistic deity. So anything else is crafting from the materials that you were given rather than creating your own self, which I think also is probably why he saw himself as channeling rather than creating a world. But yeah, so the elves were kind of the first ones, and there is this kind of talk of, I think it was like a hall. It's been a really long time since I've read the Silmarillion, but that there was almost like a hall where all the elves' soul question mark goes to afterwards, because they are they're immortal, but they're also kind of not immortal.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And when they approach the end of their time in Middle Earth, and there's a whole myth in itself as to why they're at Middle Earth. That there was a schism in the Elven community, and I know that Galadriel and Elrond are somehow involved.
Galadriel was there.
Yeah, and they came over to Middle Earth, and then they're returning, and it's presented as this strange world where they are essentially dying, but they're not. It's very strangely presented, but very compellingly presented. Because what I find really interesting about the journey from the Grey Havens to the Undying Land is that the ring bearers can go, which is how Frodo is able to travel at the end, and so is Sam in the appendices of the book, because he was a ring bearer for a short period of time. The only exception I can think of, and I don't know how Tolkien justified this beyond the fact that they're bros, is that Legolas and Gimli travelled to the Undying Land in a little boat they made. I don't know how Gimli was able to get through Undying Land customs.
Galadriel was like, he's cool.
He's cool, yeah, gave him 3 hairs. But yeah, sorry. I find that really interesting as well. There's what you tend to find with Lord of the Rings, and this is where the myth aspect I think is really rich, is that every aspect has been thought out to an incredible level of detail. And that's why, as we were saying at the beginning of this, it isn't just the novels. It's about the archives. It's about letters Tolkien wrote to people.
Yeah.
Where he would expand on the story and there's a whole separate question here about canon and so on. I generally think if Tolkien says something happened, then it happened. So you have that aspect, and then you've got the overtly Christian narrative of the story as well. You mentioned that, of course, Tolkien was a devout Catholic. I know it seems like the obvious religion pop culture 101 aspect nowadays to refer to Christ figures, but it is there.
It's there, but I think there's also a really interesting complication to the Christ narrative that's present in the Lord of the Rings, because spoilers for people who have not seen or read Lord of the Rings, Frodo at the very end, he fails. So he's not a messianic figure in the sense that he actually sacrificed himself and managed to save everyone. He was going to turn around and leave and keep it for himself. He had failed, and it was actually Gollum that sacrificed himself to save everyone, just not in recognizing that. So really the entire time it was Gollum that was the Christ figure and not Frodo, but Frodo is treated as the Christ figure. And so it's this really interesting twist on the concept of the kind of messianic savior figure that, they failed in the end. And that's not presented very often, I don't think.
No, Frodo's end is interesting in general, isn't it? Because coming back to what you were saying about the PTSD aspects, he fails in his mission. He can't let go of the ring. He has to be forcibly torn from it.
Yeah.
And it's the difference between him and Bilbo, isn't it? Is that Bilbo lets go of the ring after being told to, but he does still let go and he walks away from it. Frodo never had that moment. He never had that, which is why I think Bilbo was able to go to Rivendell and so on, and leave the Shire and enjoy the remainder of his life.
Yeah.
But Frodo was never able to let go of the ring, and it still had that destructive control over him.
Yeah, and I mean, what's interesting is when you read the Silmarillion, it's supposed to be written during just after the events of Lord of the Rings, but it's written from the perspective of basically an elven historian who doesn't know the history yet of the Lord of the Rings, because the Lord of the Rings as the texts are supposed to be written from Frodo's perspective. So basically in it, they praise Frodo and Frodo's ability to let go of the ring and to save everyone. And there's a ballad of Frodo the Nine-Fingered in the Silmarillion. But in truth, he didn't do it. And the idea is that Frodo kind of gave these tomes and then was like, and now I'm off. So that way he never had to deal with the consequences.
Yeah. And this is the PTSD aspect, isn't it? In that he wasn't able to return to his old life in the Shire.
Yeah. I mean, none of the hobbits really were.
No.
Sam was the only one that was able to kind of pretend at the end. And Sam's a really interesting figure as well, because he was tempted by the ring. They don't go into this in the movies, but in the books, Sam, when he was holding the ring for a short amount of time, the ring tried to offer him loads of stuff. And he talks about how the ring found out he liked to garden, and so showed him fields and fields of a garden that people could tend to for him. And these are what you could have. And Sam's response was, well, but I just want my garden. And he was able to turn it down. And so Sam's this really interesting figure, and it was very kind of similar to Tom Bombadil, which is another figure that doesn't pop up in the movies, that kind of had no regard for the ring in a way.
Well, Tom Bombadil puts it on and doesn't disappear, does he? I think he's the only person. No. He doesn't turn invisible when he wears it. And in the book, Sam does wear the ring when he's trying to find Frodo in Mordor, whereas he doesn't in the film. You don't see him put the ring on. Probably so that they didn't have to include the whole sequence of him being offered a garden and so on, and him being tempted by the ring, because they were pressed on time anyway. I also really like the character of Faramir from that perspective as well. And it's one of the few things that disappoints me about the movies, is that in the movie, Faramir is shown to be tempted by the ring, whereas in the book he acknowledges its power, but he is not tempted at all.
Yeah.
He pushes it away, and obviously when he becomes aware of what Dick did to his brother, and I always felt that kind of showed a strength that Faramir had that Boromir didn't, and I was a little bit disappointed that they kind of gave up on that in the film just to have that moment of him being tempted. Again, I'm afraid we're digressing there, but yeah. I just thought... But the temptations of what you're saying is interesting as well, because obviously I'm immediately thinking of the temptations of Jesus, and so on. Sam being offered that, Sam was able to turn that down. So there's that, and of course the really obvious Christ figure in the story as well is Gandalf, who has um, the arc of dying and returning,
Yeah.
um, and he very very visibly returns as well, in the sense that he's Gandalf the Grey and he returns as Gandalf the White, and there's a blinding light behind him, and in the film in particular there's a blinding light that um, means that Legolas, Aragorn and Gimli can't even make him out at first, and I think that's the most obvious one, maybe not quite as interesting as the Gollum arc is, in terms of what a Christ figure is.
Well, yeah, but I think what Gandalf really shows us is how powerful names are in the Lord of the Rings. And we could probably do a whole podcast on just names, but that would probably be slightly boring to a lot of people. But,
I'd enjoy
like,
it.
so when Gandalf comes back as Gandalf the White, it is a completely new name and therefore is kind of a new person. And there's even, I mean, it's in the movies as well, of when he comes back and they call him Gandalf and he goes, "Oh, that is what I was called once, wasn't I?"
Yes, because an extreme amount of time has passed for Gandalf, but not for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Gandalf says that even the concept of time started to slip away from him. That he was after his battle with the Balrog. Everything just seemed to go at an extremely slow pace. So yeah, he comes back and he even struggles to remember what happened before.
Yeah.
I know there's the joke that essentially he took on the Balrog himself to get extra XP so that he could level up. Comes back with his new robes. But yeah, I obviously love Gandalf, and I love his arc. But yeah, I think his Christ figure narrative is quite explicit in comparison to something like Gollum.
Yeah.
Do you say?
It's a lot more present, especially in the sense of resurrection. But I think that's what makes Lord of the Rings so interesting, is that something like Harry Potter, for instance, which has a very obvious, Christian narrative that's kind of presented. You have your Harry Potter Christ figure. Everyone kind of sees it. And it's a very kind of set, obvious thing where everyone's kind of got their roles. Lord of the Rings doesn't really follow that. And I think that's why he's a really interesting figure to look at, especially in comparison to C.S. Lewis. Where C.S. Lewis's books were very Christian focused, very messianic, very copying of the kind of savior narrative.
Oh yes, yeah.
It's so obvious, and not necessarily in a bad way, though there are interesting facets to Lewis's books. But Tolkien's I find a lot more nuanced than I think a lot of these tales tend to be, with a lot more troubling, where you can go, well, Gandalf's kind of a Christ figure because he got resurrected, but then that's kind of the end of it. But then you've got this other person who did save the world, but he failed to not be tempted and sacrifice himself. And then you have this other person who has been so corrupted by evil, but he still ended up dying to save everyone, but just did it by accident. So is that a Christ figure? Like, you've got...
Did it through selfish means.
Yeah, you've got all of these crazy nuances and kind of twists on it that makes it, in my opinion, far more interesting of a conversation.
Oh yeah, absolutely, I agree. And something else that we've touched on recently in our previous podcasts that brought Lord of the Rings into the conversation are the races that you find in Lord of the Rings, whether it's the elves, the dwarves, and so on. And the distinct character that these are given based around morality and what they do says a lot about their morality. So we mentioned in a previous podcast that the elves in Lord of the Rings are vegetarian. And they're almost presented as being more sophisticated for it. That and I don't know whether Tolkien was vegetarian himself. I'd be surprised if he was, given the time period it was written in. But the elves are definitely presented as being almost
They're more
morally.
spiritual.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So
And
they're
this is both kind of more metaphysically as well as physically. So when you kind of look at the mythology of the land, and we've already kind of talked about it, the elves were the first ones present, and they actually lived with those kind of one step down from the god beings. They lived with them and hung out with them and lived in this kind of Eden-esque land for a really long time. So, of all the races, they are both physically nearest to as well as spiritually nearest to the divine. And they're vegetarian and they can't really get drunk. There's a really nice deleted scene that's in the extended editions of Legolas having a drinking competition with Gimli, and Legolas is not being phased at all by his loads and loads of alcohol. So it kind of has, there's a really interesting element of consumption and where food plays a role, and the way that you see what people are putting in their body as an echo of their spiritual closeness.
Yes, and the fact that they have such a long lifespan as well suggests that purely from having a long lifespan, it means you have more time to learn. For a start, that they're a little bit more knowledgeable in certain areas, but also I that this is just me recalling some Lord of the Rings things I read years ago, that there is some sort of spell, for want of a better term, that makes time pass differently in Rivendell. For the sake of the elves. But they do have longer lives, and as we were saying earlier, they don't die. I mean, they can die, they can be killed, but eventually they leave Middle Earth at a time where they feel that the age of men is about to begin. The fourth age, I believe. Am I right?
Yeah, there's a really interesting story in the Silmarillion where I think it's one of the first elvish deaths was a woman who chose to die. And it is this really interesting conversation in Lord of the Rings in general, but specifically with that narrative, and it brings up this really difficult conversation about people choosing to die. And it doesn't sound like there was any suicidal action that happened. It was just an active mental choice, which is a really fascinating kind of endeavor, especially when you talk about a Catholic writer who obviously very strong Catholicism tends to frown upon suicide.
Well, it's also what I think of when I see Frodo leaving for the Grey Havens.
Mm.
He's essentially choosing to die, or at the very least, he is, but he isn't. It's this complicated nature of where they go, and coming back to that issue again. But he's leaving a lot because of this PTSD. He can't live with it. Or at the very least, he can't live with it in the Shire. And they kind of explore that in the movies as well with Arwen and Aragorn. That Arwen stays at Middle Earth to have a relationship with Aragorn, and thus chooses to die. In fact, she has a very sad end to her story as well, doesn't she? And there's this conversation in the films about how Elrond saying, "No, my daughter should go to the Undying Land so she can continue immortality," or she's essentially choosing to die so that she can have this other life with the person that she wants to be with. And something I quite like about the story is that it doesn't give you a right or wrong answer. Arwen I don't think she ever convinces Elrond that she's right to do what she does. He accepts her decision, but he isn't necessarily shown to be truly happy about her decision. And it's never presented as, oh, she made a mistake by choosing to be with Aragorn. She could have lived forever. It's very much for the audience's interpretation.
Yeah.
And I find that a lot of the things in Lord of the Rings come down to that Tolkien doesn't preach, pun not intended, about some of the moral issues that he presents, sometimes the audience can do what they want with it.
Yeah. Sometimes.
Not always.
Well, there's
but in
also
those,
there is the interesting element of gender in Tolkien, which is probably the main and one of the only issues that I
yes,
have.
well, this is what I was just thinking about now, about Elrond being happy about Arwen's decision.
Well,
Is the
yeah,
man
and I
happy?
think the movies did a fairly okay job with trying to make women slightly more present, even if by marginal means than the text.
Just one more appearance from a woman would have been good.
Because they did have Arwen have the magic to call down the water horses to save
Yes.
Frodo from the ring wraiths, which in the books was Elrond.
Yeah, so she isn't even in that scene.
No, of course not. She's a woman. She's supposed to be at home. So
She turns up at the end looking beautiful next to Aragorn, and then that's
her
it.
job. So yeah, they did kind of give her a little bit more of a, hey, I'm a human. Well, I'm a living being because she's not human, kind of scene. But what the most interesting kind of gender dynamic is Galadriel. So Galadriel is a very strong female figure in the books, and one of the only ones besides maybe Éowyn. But again, Éowyn's
I wanted
only...
to discuss Éowyn in a moment.
Well, we'll get there because it's tied to Galadriel in the sense that Galadriel has a consort, not a husband. She has a consort, and she has a consort as opposed to a husband because in Tolkien's mind, a woman cannot be a strong leader who is a woman if she's married. So Galadriel is not married to her partner. And one of the biggest issues I have with the movies is when they first show up in Lothlorien and they meet Galadriel, it's her consort. I don't even remember his name, but he talks. That
The
would
one who
never
says,
happen.
"Tell me, where is Gandalf?"
Yeah,
Yeah.
he says like, "Oh, welcome. We have heard of you. Where is Gandalf?" He does all the talking in that. In the books, I don't think he says a single word.
No.
He's just he's the female figure in that, where he's just this quiet person who maybe has a name, who tags along with Galadriel.
I don't know if that was for cinematic reasons, for the impact when you discover that Galadriel could communicate telepathically.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's why they do it, but...
I don't know. I wanted to ask you, however, what's your opinion on Éowyn as a feminist figure?
I think she's treated a bit differently in the movies, where she is that kind of female figure that is the feminist one of why are you allowed to fight and I am not, and she pulls a Mulan to pretend that she's a man to go off and fight and all that kind of stuff, which is, when you watch it as a little girl, you're like, yeah, you tell him. But the complicated thing with Éowyn is she ends up with Faramir in the end, which is a good pairing. But
Yes, it is.
my two favorite people. But she then gives up all of that and it returns to being the typical female role. Because again, in Tolkien's mind, you are not allowed to be an independent woman and be married. So she was allowed to go off and fight and be a badass because she wasn't married. Which,
Yes.
So I think if you remove that side of her story, then it's not too bad. She's obviously got that really badass feminist mantra thing at the end of "I am no man," and then stabs.
Which is a great moment.
It's a fantastic moment.
It is a great moment.
But yeah, I think Tolkien always ruins it for himself in that regard. And Galadriel and Éowyn were both examples of him really, in the letters, he actually talks about how he doesn't know what to do with them because they're these women. I just love this idea of a misogynist man writing a strong woman and then going, why did I write this?
Yeah. The reason I ask is I've had lots of really interesting conversations about Eowyn with Victoria, my wife, because really we should get her on this podcast because her master's is in religion and popular culture. Um,
Yeah.
she um, she finds Eowyn a little frustrating because of course she loves the "I am no man" moment, and so on, and Eowyn being a kick-ass woman and all. But um, whenever we rewatch Lord of the Rings, she says that she feels a little conflicted. The fact that to her it seems that Eowyn can only be a feminist figure if she's pretending to be a man.
Mm,
That she's not able to own her feminine identity. That she has to be like a man to therefore be a feminist figure.
yeah.
Obviously, being a man myself, this isn't really something that I. So I fully accept that men should just shut up and listen. So I'm just shutting up and listen to what you say and what Victoria says. But it is interesting when she has her rant about how Eowyn is a great feminist figure, but at the same time there is that problematic nature where she's a feminist figure in that she tries to be a man. And it is important to show that women can do what men can do, which I think is the point of it. If Eowyn is presented as a feminist figure, it's because she is able to fight and so on and be this independent, powerful person. But at the same time, if Victoria was sat here now, she'd say that she sort of loses some of her feminine identity in doing that.
Yeah.
Uh, but,
I mean, yeah. I mean, she's not my favorite feminist icon in popular culture. In fact, I think one of my favorite ones would be Brave.
yes, I keep meaning to watch Brave because you keep telling me to watch it.
I have mentioned this multiple times on different podcasts now, but I think Brave to me is one of the best feminist movies, especially for children. But I think even just in general. Because, again, Eowyn also has a love story. An unrequited one. But it's a love story. And I always get kind of annoyed when that has to be present. And there's another example of that in the movies that we shall not name.
Well, a whole character was invented purely for that reason.
Yeah, and it's like I wasn't against the creation of a female character because again, Tolkien has a really strong lack
Especially in The Hobbit.
especially in The Hobbit.
Yes.
The Lord of the Rings isn't much better, but they were at least able to play up and really lean into the 2 or 3 characters that you get given. Galadriel, Eowyn, and Arwen are both given far bigger roles than they were in the books in order to really try to show that position. But there really isn't that to even play into in The Hobbit. So I wasn't really necessarily against the creation of a female character for the sake of it. But the way they dealt with it was, I think, problematic in the fact that they then basically did all the bad things of like, you didn't have to give her a love story because she was made up. You could have just had her be anything.
Yeah.
She could have just been there. But yeah, I get annoyed with love stories always connected to women figures. And that
The fact it was a love triangle as well.
Yeah, it's this thing of how in popular culture most women characters can't exist unless they are falling in love or actively in love with somebody.
And you see it at the end, like you were saying, you see it at the end of Eowyn's arc.
Yeah.
When she essentially returns to being a housewife because she's with Faramir all of a sudden.
Yeah. So yeah, you see it with Eowyn, and she had that kind of attempt at a love story with Aragorn. It didn't work out. She's with Faramir. She becomes the housewife and stays at home and is happy because she got her moment of glory, and that's all she really needed, of course. And you've got Arwen. You've got Arwen.
This major part of her character is now gone.
Arwen's entire position in the narrative is just Aragorn's boo, and again, has a
especially
really
in the books.
depressing result of her love story And Galadriel doesn't necessarily actually have that, but then the movies made her consort talk to her or for her, so it was almost like undid some of it. But with Brave, and we could probably do a separate episode on Brave potentially, but with Brave, there's no love story anywhere. In fact, if there's any love story, it's between a girl and her mother rather than a so there's no male figure for the devotion. And that's why, to me, it's one of the best feminist narratives.
Yeah.
Welcome to Feminist Conversations with Vivian.
Yeah. Oh, I always enjoy these.
Speaking of which, actually, it'd be a good segue from discussions of feminism to back to Lord of the Rings, which is, and we can talk about this briefly, is the connection of the ring itself as a symbol of power. And I mentioned the feminism because obviously both myself and Alid currently have symbols of this power on our own fingers.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And the whole narrative is that power corrupts, which I find quite interesting, is that anybody who becomes remotely involved with the One Ring is corrupted one way or another, was tempted by corruption. But as you were saying, it's a symbol as well as an object. Yeah,
rings are these symbols of ownership and devotion, and how the ring is able, as the One Ring is able to use that as a way of demonstrating its own ownership and control. And in a similar fashion, which my husband will be very upset with me saying this, that my wearing of a ring is essentially a symbol of devotion as well as control and power between, I would say, the two of us jointly. But historically,
yeah.
Historically, has not always been the case. In fact, when I was getting married to him, I had a big debate within myself of whether or not I even wanted to wear a wedding ring. Because of the history and how weirdly feminist I am. So I decided to do it for a couple of different reasons, one of which is to make the immigration process slightly easier. But the other of it is that I just had to recognize that for us, the symbol is different.
Yes. You have to do what's right for you and not what it necessarily means elsewhere.
Yeah.
And it's the same with us.
Out of curiosity, and I can get rid of this if need be. Did Toria have somebody walk her down the aisle when you guys got married?
Yes, she did. She had her dad. She wanted it.
I mean, that's fair.
Yeah, we did things quite differently at our wedding. Actually, in keeping with this conversation, actually, we had a passage from Lord of the Rings read at the ceremony, specifically the Ballad of the Ents and the Entwives from Two Towers. Worked really well, actually, because my friend Gareth read the part of the Ent, and Toria's sister read the part of the Entwives, and they bounced it back and forth between each other.
Oh,
it was really
cool.
Nice. And we did things quite unconventionally, because even though she walked down the aisle she walked down the aisle with her father, which is very conventional. The wedding march that was playing was from Queen's Flash Gordon soundtrack. So it was this epic Brian May guitar solo. One of our finest moments, that. I'm very pleased with that. Yeah, absolutely.
I would love to walk down the aisle to the Imperial March.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be good fun, wouldn't it?
No, because we didn't even have like a walking down the aisle thing, because me and my husband just went to the registry office and did it there. But like, so we started already in the front, and none of my family was present. So yeah, but I think that even if we did have a big thing, I didn't want to be walked down the aisle by anybody.
Toria's always had a very close relationship with her father.
That's fair.
And I think for her it's more to do with that than the
Yeah. I
conventions.
mean, my sister was walked by our dad, and I wouldn't say she's not a feminist at all. So like, I don't hold it against anyone. I was just
Oh
curious.
yeah, 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 yeah. No, no. Weddings are a very interesting conversation, aren't they? Because there are some aspects, certainly from our perspective, there were some traditional aspects that we wanted purely because we liked them and we thought it was nice. And certain things are recognizably weddingy, to coin a phrase. And people there can latch onto it and say, "Oh, this is that moment that they always do, like cutting of the cake and stuff like that." We did that because we like cake.
Yeah.
Um, but there were other aspects that we weren't particularly interested in. So we technically got married before our ceremony because we wanted the ceremony to actually be run by a friend of ours,
Right.
and he was going to quote religious texts, and I use the word religious because it wasn't only Christianity. And the legal people, the registrar, had to leave the premises before religion could be mentioned.
Huh.
So our plan was is that he would do the ceremony, and then they would be there at the end for us to sign the documents. But they were not allowed to be on the premises. See, this does have to do something with religion. They were not allowed to be on the premises if religion was being mentioned in the ceremony. So they had to begin the ceremony, marry us, and they left, and then we could do the ceremony that we wanted to have because we wanted to have religious aspects. I mean, interestingly, both Tori and I. Interestingly, we are so interesting. I think taking a step back, Tori and I are both humanists, but we wanted religious aspects, explicitly religious aspects to our wedding, and that there was a bit of a panic the week beforehand when the registrar saw what we had planned and said, "Yeah, we're not going to be able to be there if you're doing this." So we switched everything around. So we were actually married before what we consider to be the actual ceremony.
That's fair. I think that happens sometimes. If some people will do it like the day or two before, just to so that way they can do what they want for the
What they
ceremony.
want.
Because I mean,
Yeah.
I obviously did it only at the registrar, so there was a lot of like weird timings, and we didn't have our rings at the time. So there was like a weird gap where they're not allowed to start writing the wedding certificate or the marriage certificate until you say certain words. And so normally you would say the certain words, then you do the whole ring exchange, and he would be writing during that time. And then when it was done, and you could be like, cool. But we didn't have rings, so we just kind of awkwardly said a couple of extra things. Like,
I love you.
the person that was like running it had a couple, like they had some like stock like love sayings
Love
and
is
things
great.
like that. So they just kind of kept talking like that after we did our
Yeah.
things.
That's interesting as well. I know this is a tangent, but it's just pointing out the absurdities of our society. That we weren't allowed to take photos of us signing
Yeah, we
the
weren't
certificate.
either.
Yeah, and then they said, "Oh, but that's okay. We've got these fake ones that you will now sign while the photos are taken." And in the photos of Toria and I signing it, you can see we're both laughing because I just turned to her before we did it and I said, "This is just utterly ridiculous.
Yeah.
Why are we doing this? We look so stupid." Like, we're not even writing anything. Nobody's going to believe we're actually. Why are we doing this?
Yeah.
But we did have Lord of the Rings
We should have an
quoted.
entire episode on weddings. I wonder if we could get Toria and Tom on.
Yeah, why not?
I think that might be fun.
Why
But
not?
maybe we'll do that for a separate episode.
Our vows were also the wedding vows from Game of Thrones.
I
was
would have
back
done
when Game of
lots
Thrones
of
was
Lord
cool.
of the Rings. Oh well.
Yeah. Well, you could always do some sort of other ceremony.
Yeah. When, maybe if we ever have money.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's the other thing, isn't it? That was another reason why we rejected a lot of the aspects of weddings that we thought were a little bit much, because they're just so obscenely expensive.
I mean, yes.
Anyway, I hope our listeners really enjoyed that last few minutes where we.
I'm so sorry. We'll copy and paste that to a different episode later.
But no, I think it's still somewhat related in that it bounced off our conversation about women and Lord of the Rings. I think that's what
And
happened,
the
wasn't it?
power of the symbols of rings.
The power of there we go. That's I knew there was something a little
Because
bit more.
Sauron's eye is also a big. That's a whole other thing. We can have multiple episodes, I think, on the symbols in Lord of the Rings, on ritual mechanics, on mythology,
Yes.
on
And
loads.
Sauron's really interesting as well, isn't he? Because even though there's the Eye of Sauron, in the tower he does have some sort of physical form.
Yeah.
At one point he is seen.
Well, and there's also like you can see him like moving around and stuff. Like in it, it's very like Foucault's Panopticon. Like
Yeah. And he's very much omnipresent as well. I mean, I think that's part of the point of the ring as well, is that
yeah.
he's often aware of what's happening around the ring. Did you know, last bit of trivia for the audience before we finish, that in the original cut of the movie, that fight Aragorn has with a massive orc was originally with Sauron?
What?
Yeah, they had Sauron come out into the battle for Middle-earth and fight Aragorn. Do you know which orc I'm referring to? There's a massive orc that Aragorn is fighting.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, in the original cut, that was Sauron he was fighting. And then I think Sauron would then just explode when...
Well, because I know that they got a bunch of like Tolkien specialists to be on set. Did they go, "What the fuck you doing?"
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you even need to be a Tolkien specialist to think that's a bad idea. So because it was CG'd anyway, they were able to just make it a particularly large orc.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was originally Sauron.
One of my favorite like scary characters, because obviously I'm into horror and things that are a bit uncanny and creepy, but the mouth of Sauron, who's that orc that comes out to like greet them at the gate. And I don't know if it's in the theatrical cut or not, so if you are listening and you don't know what I'm talking about, go get yourself those extended editions.
Yes.
But he comes out and he's the one that throws all of Frodo's stuff in order to try to be like, look, we killed him, but they didn't. And he's got this like mouth that moves so weirdly, and it's one of the creepiest characters that I saw. Like the first time I saw it, I was quite young, and because as you know, I'm a lot younger than you, so I was quite young when I
Not
saw
a
these
lot.
movies. By a lot.
A little bit.
By like 20 years. But yeah, so it really stuck with me, but it's one of my favorite characters when it comes to conversations about like uncanny horror, creepy creatures. He's like one of my favorites.
Yes, he is very creepy, and you never see the rest of his face.
Yeah, you only ever
It's only
see
the
like
mouth.
nose down, and he's got this crazy mouth that just does some weird things.
And Aragorn is clearly weirded out for him.
Everyone's looking at him like, what is that?
Yes, and the mouth of Sauron, he's literally the mouth of Sauron as well, isn't he? He's communicating
Yeah.
Sauron's words to the Fellowship, or what remains of the Fellowship. That's the one thing that really that's something that really bugs me in the films, is that, oh, look, it's Frodo's mail. Oh, he suffered, Gandalf, he suffered. And, for Frodo. And I'm sat here thinking, and Sam?
Yeah. I was like, Sam was there too.
Sam is presumably also dead. And then whenever we watch the films at the end where they're going, Frodo, both Tori and I will go, and Sam. We're very sad people.
I mean, that's a conversation about classism as well, but...
Well, yes, that's the thing. He's Frodo's employee.
Yeah.
Calls him Mr. Frodo and everything.
Like a true Englishman.
Like
lots
a
of
true
classism in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Anyway.
But I think what we got to is that there's a lot that can be said
Yes,
and a lot to be dug into. And I will definitely want us to come back to Lord of the Rings.
I would definitely like us to come back to it as well. Yes, please, because it's amazing. I think this conversation has pointed out how many even tangents you can go on because of Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And how Lord of the Rings is therefore not only interesting in terms of the content of the story, but also what you can discuss about the world around you using that. Which is precisely why the study of religion and popular culture is important.
Yeah. It's amazing and wonderful, and everyone should be interested.
Yes, it's about more than simply what you're consuming. It's about what it tells you about yourself.
Share this podcast with somebody you think would be interested.
Yes, share this podcast with somebody.
What is it that
likes
podcasters always say? Like not like and subscribe. That's YouTube. Give us 5 stars on iTunes.
Give us 5 stars on iTunes. Subscribe to the podcast. And if people want to discuss Lord of the Rings with you, Vivian, where should they go?
They should go to Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok. I am at Vivian Asimos on all of those.
You're fully set up now.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really. I've only ever put on our promos to the podcasts, but I will start doing actual TikToks at some point soon. I'll figure it out. Dancing in your bedroom. Sorry,
I will get mileage out of that joke.
But you can also go to my website, incidentalmythology.com, which is an entire blog on religion and popular culture if you are enjoying this.
Absolutely.
And where can they talk to you about Lord of the Rings, Alan?
Come talk to me about Lord of the Rings on my Twitter page at AladJLL Thomas, and especially do that on New Year's Eve. Every New Year's Eve, my wife and I watch the entire extended edition in one sitting. So we are in full-on Lord of the Rings mode. So if you happen to be bored on New Year's Eve and you want to talk about Lord of the Rings, definitely talk to me then, because I'll be very excited.
Yay!
So I think we'll end it there for today, but we'll come back soon with more Lord of the Rings for your ear holes. And stay safe, everyone.
Stay safe. Bye.